Okay, so I think we're gone live
We
now.
live?
Yes, we are streaming. So,
Fantastic.
okay, so hello, Phil.
Hello.
So it's we were just saying, weren't we? It's about a couple of years since you were working with me, working
Yeah,
through the 2-month program, and we've kept in touch every now and again
we
since.
have.
And you've been on your own incredible journey as you've sort of progressed along. And as I was saying earlier, and I say this to a number of my patients, this recovery is not just about that, is it? It's not just we'll start here and we'll suddenly get better. Sometimes that can happen with some people where it may be a book recovery and they're just suddenly
Mm,
better. Unfortunately, often there's not as many learning experiences with that because maybe they haven't learned, certainly what you've been learning from the challenges, learning about our personalities, how to deal with stuff from our past life, etc. And it's just interesting to watch how people progress, learn from the challenges, and that's the important thing. Is sometimes having somebody else to support and guide can help that.
definitely.
But also, as you found yourself, it's about working through all this. And then, as we're doing this, because it's a journey, you start finding other things that help, and then other books that might be interesting, and integrating it into your own life. So basically, being able to really look at how you can evolve with your own life with the more the understanding that you have.
Yes. Yeah, I would agree. And I think, for my journey, which is, obviously what one of the things we're here to kind of go through,
Mhm.
mine starts around about probably 20 years ago, when I had RSI. So I started struggling with um, uh, arm pains, and that moved up to kind of neck pains and some headaches, and became a bit sensitive to light, bright lights, and all sorts of stuff. Started happening, and that carried on for probably 4 years. And for people who have, chronic illnesses like this, it's you realize it's exhausting. I remember when I was working, I'd come out of work, and I'd just be shattered just from the tired, feeling tired of the amount of pain that I'd been in for that day. Um, I actually started doing two things. So I saw a physio, which was what I originally thought was going to be the solution. And I remember her saying to me at the start, well, where do you want to be, or where do you think you'll be in 2 years' time? And I said, well, I'm hoping I'll be pretty much recovered, 95% recovered. And she said, that's an important part of this. And I didn't really understand that at the time. Um, at the time also, I had some things that, were going on in my life that I wasn't happy about. I felt stressed just too much all of the time. And I started to see a counselor, and decided to, go through all of that side of my life. And she said, I look back with amusement. She said at the time, oh, well, maybe as we're doing this stuff, the pain will recede. And I didn't really believe that at the time, if I'm being really honest. I was very logical and, scientific and things, and I'd never heard of this stuff before. So I look back at the timings now, and I think, as I started to regain some confidence in my life, and take and turn off some of the external stresses that I was just bringing into myself, the pain did start to recede. But I didn't connect the two things at the time at all. Um, and then if we fast forward maybe 10 or 15 years, sadly, my mum passed away. And, it's never a good time losing parents. It's just horrendous. But I gained 5 months worth of intolerances to all sorts of foods. So the amount of food that I could eat just every week would slowly come in and in. And again, I didn't realize why. And I went to the doctors, and they didn't seem concerned that there was anything wrong. And I was sat there going, I don't understand this. There's clearly something wrong. There's something wrong with me. But they, almost relatively over about 1 month, it kind of just receded, and I went back to normal. Um, then later in that year, I took up skiing, and I was concerned about breaking my leg and how it would affect my my job, which was, fairly physically based, and a bunch of other things. And I didn't realize how much stress, internal stress, these thoughts were really putting on me. And as time came to, this, or came closer to the skiing holiday, I bought some ski boots, and they didn't fit me very well, and I got some numbness in one foot. And I never had that before, but I had what I thought was nerve issues before from RSI, and all of that fear and concern came back. What will happen with my income? What will happen with this? Just flooded, myself with anxiety, and the original nerve compression obviously sorted itself out over a few days. But then I started to get pain, and the pain got worse and worse and worse. And it was Christmas time, and I couldn't get into any doctors. And I went to see someone, and I started researching on the internet. Never do that. And I, it literally got to the stage where I was, pretty much bedbound with this, this pain. I didn't know what was going on. I was researching. I rung a few people, and they were saying, "Oh, it could be this, it could be that, it could be the other." And I just got more and more and more anxious, and this pain took over my life. It completely took over my life, and I didn't recognize, the signs back then, because I've never been exposed to this, more mind-body pain. Well, I had, but I didn't realize it. And unfortunately, I found a friend who'd heard of the, the SIRPA approach, and he said, well, go and, speak to these people and see whether there's, there's something in it. And I had my first call with one of your SIRPA therapists, and I was unconvinced, if I'm being honest, but I thought, well, I don't really have a lot to lose at this point. I'll go down and I'll see. And we started talking about, how, pain worked, and, looking at the stresses in life, and going through the process, the SIRPA process. And over, by that time, actually, things had got a lot worse. I didn't just have pain in one foot. It had managed to make its way to all sorts of areas. So if I went and sat down in my car, I would have a lot of pain in my legs. If I went and sat in other chairs, it was fine. It was just in my car. But then I went to the cinema, and I obviously thought, oh, I wonder whether it'll happen at the cinema. That triggers anxiety and fears and all of that kind of thing. Suddenly I got pain in my legs in the cinema halfway through the film. And I actually had to leave because I was in so much pain. So yeah, it just expanded, kind of more and more. But as I started to do the kind of SIRPA approach, I remember one day thinking, how can this happen to someone twice? And I felt so sad, that this was happening again, and, it was taking over my life again. And I think at that point, I hit some kind of mild rock bottom and thought, right, okay, I need to really, really work with this approach now. And I was probably on my second or maybe third session at that point. And I started journaling hugely. I would rather than researching, for 4 hours a day on, cures for my foot pain, I was journaling for literally 4 hours a day on everything that was that had been happening in my life. I went through everything. I uncovered every stone, everything that had gone on in my life, because obviously back then I didn't really quite understand what the stresses in my life were. And I'm really pleased to say that, within 2 or 3 months of that, no, maybe about two, I was pretty much back to normal. And I went to see the doctors, and I said, well, I'm back to normal. And because at the time I decided to go on some anxiety medication for a short while, and I'd only been on them for maybe 3 months. And he said, are you sure? And I was like, no, I'm not anxious anymore. All of this stuff that had been causing me stress, has now receded, and I just don't have that anymore.
So are we talking the pain, or were the stomach issues as well?
Yeah, so the stomach issues actually were I was just going to come on to those because that's how we started talking. Stomach
No,
issues.
but you, sorry, just let me
Sorry.
pause for a moment. You mentioned when your mum died, you started
Mm,
becoming intolerant to a number of foods. So when
yes,
you said that you were better, was that the pain or was that included?
it was the pain. So the intolerances had gone after about 5 months.
Right,
They just receded on their own,
right,
which was good. But my probably long-term stomach issues, which was more kind of um, gastric issues, those kinds of things, which was one of the reasons that, I originally came to speak to you specifically, Georgie. Um, they just carried on and on and on. That didn't recede on its own.
right.
Um, and in fact, one of the reasons that we started talking was not because of the stomach issues that came out in our sessions, but it was a bout of folliculitis or adult acne, if you would want to call it that. Um, so skin-related issues, and and that's when we started talking, and I started to take a look at the other stresses in my life, which I say I uncovered every little thing, every little stone, but I didn't uncover them all. I uncovered all the ones that I wanted to, and maybe some of the ones that I didn't, kind of I left alone.
And sometimes
And
it can be helpful to talk to somebody else to help you remember them or even connect that maybe they're actually relevant. And can I also just say that the reason we started working was that you'd been seeing Maria
yes,
and beginning to improve and obviously doing well with the pain, but then she went travelling.
she did exactly.
Possibly, I dare she, and you were looking for somebody else to work with.
I wasn't that. That's exactly right. Um, no, you're right. I think sometimes there are things which cause us an enormous amount of stress in our lives, which maybe we don't even recognize. We don't know that those are the things that are causing us a lot of stress. And I look a lot these days at what I should do versus what I want to do. I think for me that's a big stressor. So, I want to be doing this thing and I feel like I should be doing this thing.
Yeah.
And I try and force myself down the should be doing path rather than the want to be doing path. And over time that just, causes huge amounts of stress. And I start to feel the anxiety and the kind of chest and those kind of symptoms, and it just takes a little downward spiral from there. But
I
the
just
good
stop you for a moment, Phil.
of
Sorry,
course.
just at that point, just to say hello to everybody who is watching, and thank you for
Hello.
joining us. And start thinking about any questions, whatever Phil's talking about. If you'd like to just pop in and say hello, for example. But if you would like to ask any questions of Phil, then start writing them in, and then we'll get to them as we can. But for now, we're just going to carry on for a little bit, and then as we start getting questions, we'll start answering those. So sorry, carry on.
No, it's absolutely fine. We're here for questions, which is
We are.
it's the kind of
We're
the
not here
good
just to chat to each other.
no, exactly. It's a coffee chat. So yeah, so I think the difficulty sometimes with not speaking to someone is because you may not know how you're experiencing some of the things in your own life and how much stress it's really causing. The outside's uh, view of that can be really, really important. Obviously, you'll see that with your other clients.
Absolutely. And when you came to me, it was predominantly at that point for the folliculitis and
It
these
was.
issues. And
It
it was
was.
about just helping you to start look back, reflect, see, like you said about like your mum dying and all the things that were
Mm.
going on in your life now, but also the things that had been leading, from the past. But
Mm.
also, I think, for you, as well as for many of us, including myself, it was very much a matter of looking at our behaviours and personality traits and beginning to see how we create so much stress, which you touched on yourself. And it's not
Yeah.
what's happening,
It,
dealing with it.
I mean, the folliculitis was an interesting one. That turned up when my about 6 to 12 months after my um, my mum died, I think. And so there was obviously, stress that I wasn't, I wasn't dealing with. Um, and what was really interesting was with that was, again, going back to the internet research. I started doing massive amounts of research on the internet and built myself up this story and this, it's going to be there forever and it'll do this and it'll do that. And then I heard other people saying, oh, it's terrible and you never get rid of it and it spreads everywhere, and it started to spread everywhere. And the really interesting one actually was, one night I thought, and this is your thought process, how you think, or how I think, or how I used to think.
Yeah.
I thought, oh, well, it's related to hair and hair follicles. What if I get one on my, a spot on my my eyelid? And I woke up the next morning, and guess what I got? Spot on my eyelid. And it was actually probably that was the moment where I thought, this is ridiculous.
Yes.
It's clearly, it's very, very clearly related to my thoughts and feelings, as opposed to some kind of physical process, which I'd maybe not been quite convinced of previously to that. But I thought, no, you can't go to bed one night and not have one there, have that thought,
Absolutely.
and then it literally turns up the next day. I found, sorry.
That's good, because you can include that in an evidence sheet to actually write that down, so that when you're having a bad day, you can look at that and say, well, that didn't make sense because I had that thought and developed that. And and actually using an evidence sheet can be really helpful. I just want to say hello to Caroline, who've all said hello, and thank you for talking to them. And I'm sure there are others joining in as well now. And then don't forget, any questions from what you've heard, do include them.
Yeah, please. Questions are good. Yeah, talking about the evidence thing, I think that's, I exposed that, or learned very much that I had a, health anxiety quite considerably, which really came around from the RSI days. I don't remember particularly having it as a child, but that's when, I started to get concerned about things. And I remember where I had the foot injury from the ski boot, and that was in my left foot. And I went to the doctor all happy one day when I've been starting working with Maria. And I said, the pain's moved from my left foot to my right foot. And he said, well, that's great, because, clearly, you haven't injured your right foot, and it must be, some kind of mind body pain. And he said, and maybe in time you can talk it away completely. And that's certainly what happened. So evidence can be really great when pain starts. I've seen this from the a Facebook group that I'm involved with, but when people start to see their pain moving around, that can be the time where it kind of loses its hold a little bit. And I'm sure you see the same.
Yeah, and I think it's. I remember you saying in the past months ago, I'm really finding it just quite fun, because once you'd resolved your symptoms, it was then, if a symptom popped up, thinking, oh, now that's interesting. What's that about? And it is very much about moving from the fear. Once you really understand it and recognize it's just the body, it's a protective response and it's a signal from within. Oh, there's something that we need to deal with. And once you recognise that and you've dealt with the fears, then it is interesting, isn't it? Just that, oh, okay, what's going on now that's causing this?
It is, and life changes and maybe gets a little bit easier, because it's like having an alarm bell. It's almost like a body's alarm bell to say, well, there's something here that you're not dealing with. You need to be dealing with that, and over time. I know something I've said to a lot of people is that when you first start down, this path and you have pain, you just want to, quote, get rid of it. Everyone uses that phrase in the early days, and I did, and you pulled me up on it many times. You just want to get rid of it. It's like, I don't want that in my life. But you're right about the protective feeling. This is actually a system which is trying to protect you. It's trying to help you to understand that there are things in your life which you're not dealing with, and it's doing its best to to kind of help you with that. So this becomes something that it's possibly one of the best things that happened to you rather than the worst. And I think, you know,
So
most people
hard for
only,
people to understand that when they're starting out.
it is. And I was totally in that position as well. You know, it's very, very difficult to appreciate that. But in the, you know, once you're past all of the actual symptoms, or certainly they're reducing down, and you maybe your anxiety about them is reducing, you know, you start to look at your life and go, well, actually, you know, this isn't right, and that's not right, and maybe, you know, my symptoms are really trying to show me that.
Yeah.
So that's, you know, that's great when that starts to happen.
When do you feel the big shift really started happening with you when you were starting going through this?
In terms of the reduction in pain or the change of
Yes,
life?
to your understanding of it, and when you got over those fears, and because that presumably at that point was when the symptoms began to change
Mm.
more.
Yeah, okay. So I think over the years, my understanding has kind of deepened, and it has changed a lot. You know, in the early stages, I went through the processes, and I probably didn't quite understand why I was going through the processes. Not really understand.
So
Um,
consciously doing it, but then not a deep unconscious acceptance.
Exactly, not really understanding why that was. It was so I think I've thrown myself into this world, you know, in terms of, you know, trying to understand, you know, what it really means for me in my life. And maybe a year in or thereabouts, I started to really spot little things in my life and create these connections, and understand how it could help my life. Um, in terms of understanding, you know, all of the symptoms and the pains and those kinds of things, you know, they receded relatively quickly, relatively being an order of months normally. But the kind of deeper understanding of, you know, what it was really doing for me and for my life, um, I think that started maybe about a year in, you know, when I started to really understand that. And, you know, I read books, some of the ones that you recommended to me. I found other people who were experiencing kind of, you know, similar things, you know, in different kind of areas. And I think, you know, now I do look around and I go, so many people with these kinds of things that don't really even realize it,
Yeah.
and maybe the ones, you know, who really, you know, start to engage with this, you know, this kind of process, you know, they're the ones that are very, very extreme with it, as in they have a large amount of pain and it lasts for a long time. But a lot of people may have other conditions that they never really look at, you know, some headaches, for example, or, you know, those kinds of things. And, you know, oh, my back's gone, you know, those kinds of things. And then you start to think about, well, what's been going on in their life in, you know, the last however many months. And then you think, well, yeah, it's pretty likely that your back hasn't really gone at all. You know, you just not dealt with whatever it was that was
Yeah.
going on.
And sometimes it's not all about just consciously understanding and really being able to pinpoint things, but actually being able to just deal with how you're feeling rather than
Absolutely.
trying to work everything out. And what I think is interesting with you is that you've got very involved with the TMS group on Facebook as well, haven't you? So being and really learned from that, but also primarily, especially over the last year or so, really being there as someone who's gone through it to be able to advise other people, which is lovely.
Yeah, so it's been great. You know, it's nice to find a group of people that you know, that become almost a tribe, and you know, your tribe, to use a kind of a more modern term. Um, so I've been really, you know, helped by looking at other people's journeys, and this is one of the reasons that, you know, I wanted to kind of be here today. Um, it's it's difficult, you know, when you're first starting out on this, you know, everyone seems to start from the same point, you know, could this thing be, you know, TMS? You know, here's a set of symptoms. And then it's really interesting to see, you know, over time, as they start to understand, you know, a bit more about TMS, they do take that journey to, here's my life, here's what's happened to me, here's where I'm at the moment, here's my stressors, you know, the things that you know, trigger me and cause me extreme stress. And you know, and when I start to, as you say, you know, experience the emotions that maybe I'm not allowing myself to experience. You know, people, they move down a pretty standard path. And you know, as I say, start down here with the it's all about the symptoms, and end up with, you know, at this end, which it's my life, and you know, how can I improve that?
And we can't unlearn what we've learned. And as you say, this is our life and how we live it and how we deal with what's happening in our lives. It's
Yeah,
not about having to do this, but it's about actually, do you know what? If we're going to live a life with less resistance, if we're going to make it easier for ourselves, then
yeah.
actually by looking after ourselves first, that makes it easier. It actually brings us neatly onto the first question that's
We have a
come.
question. Great.
Now we've got a few now. And I'm going to let you answer. I know what I would say to this, but I'm going to let you answer this, Phil, because I think
Go on.
it's interesting. So, and I know Dan's here, he's got a question as well, and Dan was our Q&A a couple of weeks ago.
Yes, I saw
So
that.
Julia says, sorry about this, Dan, you've probably seen this anyway. Julia says, after listening to the great interview 2 weeks ago, I immediately got pretty bad back pain. Back pain isn't my primary problem at all, and I wasn't worried about it at all. I'm nearly back to normal, not sure if I should be listening to this. So I'm sorry about that, Julia, but
Sorry.
Phil, what would you say to that?
Well, I'll give you my own view, and then I'd actually be interested in your view as well. So, throughout my life, I recognized that I was quite susceptible to things. So, if I was chatting to, say, a friend, and they said, "Oh, you know, I've just had, you know, this problem with my, you know, with a leg or something like that," suddenly I'd get a problem with my leg. And I'm like, that seems really strange. And for years, I did wonder, this was all before I understood anything about, you know, mind body pain. I did wonder at the time. I was thinking, how is that even possible? Why am I getting all of these kind of symptoms from reading it, but from listening or speaking to people? I think, you know, from a patient's point of view, I would say that, you know, the susceptibility, you know, you become quite susceptible and have some kind of health anxiety around certain things. And when you look at, you know, what other people have or have experienced, you start to kind of focus on those and wonder and think, well, what if I get that? And I explained, you know, my situation in the cinema where, you know, I used to have, you know, pain in my legs when I was driving, and then I sat in the cinema and I was like, well, I wonder if I'll get pain in the cinema, and I did. It literally just turned up. And then the situation with my, you know, my eye as well. I think it, you know, to me, it would be an indicator that there is stresses, um, or are stresses, which probably do need to be looked at. That would be my, you know, my general point. I think, you know, if if life becomes too anxious, too fearful, and too difficult to kind of deal with, to the point where you start to kind of almost close yourself in and think, well, I can't be exposed to this and I can't be exposed to that, I think it would be a good time to be, you know, having a look at that. So that would be my kind of general thought.
Thank you. Okay, so the other thing I would say, Julia, is if something has triggered you, there was a trigger in that call, whether it was you related to something that Dan said, whether, you know, and that's often the case, it will trigger something, even if it's a trigger that you're not aware of. That means, as Phil said earlier, that it's just indicating to you that there are emotions that have been stirred up and that you would benefit from acknowledging and expressing those. So, for example, even after this call, finishing off and just free writing onto paper, and you might at some point write down why did I develop back pain last week, and then or 2 weeks ago, and maybe specify after the call, after the Q&A session on the SIRPA Facebook page, why did I develop back pain? Because then what you do is you just free write, stream of consciousness journaling, offload your thoughts onto paper, and you just follow your thoughts, which will dart all around, and often you'll gain insights from that. But the fact is, again, like Phil said, it's about when you get a symptom, it's dealing with the fears and recognizing it's a protective response. So this is about, okay, that's interesting. Why have I developed pain? I've just been sitting on a webinar. Why would I develop pain now? And that again, you could either journal, you could do some emotional awareness, somatic tracking, but to really allow yourself to acknowledge and express the emotions. And even if you don't understand, it's not as important as actually being able to allow the emotions to transition through your body. That's more important. Okay.
I was terrible for that, by the way. I don't know if you remember, but as you say, I say I have a very scientific mind and I want to understand everything at the nth degree. And it took a long time to switch me around from this is my understanding of a situation to literally there are emotions there that I'm not handling or allowing to surface. And I still probably fall into that trap sometimes today, but my body lets me know when it does happen.
It's a reaction at first. You know enough now to actually, oh, okay, how am I feeling? What's
Yes,
actually
exactly, exactly.
and sometimes dealing with fear can be about a specific symptom. It can be about writing an unsent letter to
Yeah.
or to your pain, and literally treating it as an entity and an unsent letter. You know, what are you doing? You're ruining my life. I hate you. You know, and really acknowledging and expressing and catastrophizing. If you are catastrophizing in your head, offload that onto paper, and then end by rationalizing it and looking at the evidence side of it. What you maybe times when you haven't had pain when you would expected it, or you had pain and you wouldn't normally have pain, or you'd like Phil, you know, thought about something and you developed it, and reassure yourself and remind yourself that the pain is a protective response. It's just a signal protecting you from what's perceived to be a threatening emotion, or from you falling apart, or from ruining your self-image. If you suddenly swear at somebody in a meeting at work, you know, that would not go down well. So actually having a symptom, suddenly getting a headache or back pain, would probably protect you from losing your job, for example. Okay, moving on, because we've got a few now. So Stephanie says, one of her questions, did the skin issues all clear up?
98%. So I had a significant amount on my head, and they started to kind of, you know, move down into my chest and things as I worried about them more. Today, on the very odd occasion, you know, you know, a spot will turn up, but it's 90, as I say, 98% resolved. I did manage to find.
Sorry, I presume what you do is then when it's just like having a pain, you get to stop and you think, okay, what's going on in my life that I'm not dealing with.
Exactly right, and it takes, you know, pain can come on very, very suddenly, whereas, you know, a spot or other skin conditions can be a little bit slower. So you sometimes have to think back a little bit more and forward a little bit more. So you know, what happened to me a week ago as opposed to what happened to me just now because I was in a call and something activated something. But yes, you know, it's, you know, 98% resolved.
And I remember when we were working together, you faced some challenges while we were working, which is always good because it's about looking at what's happened. I remember one was while you were on holiday and you emailed, and it was about looking at what you telling me what had happened, and then actually being able to put that into perspective, be able to rationalize things, to offload how you're feeling, etc. But that's again a great opportunity for growth, isn't it, when you face those?
It was, and you know, I mean, so one thing I would say, you know, a number of people with, you know, kind of TMS conditions will suffer from is, you know, it can be, you know, shame, embarrassment, you know, guilt, all of those kinds of emotions, and you know, that don't really get a chance to kind of come to the top and be expressed or felt, and that was certainly the case that was happening, you know, with me on holiday, and why I suddenly got, you know, a few specific spots. And it was interesting, you know, with that particular one, because it was a spot that I'd had before that was triggered in a very similar circumstance. So, you know, at that point again, I was like, I had to have a look. These days I try and sort of chuckle to myself about these kind of things. You know, I think it's a very good positive thing to do, to kind of go, you know, that's just amusing that this, you know, this turned up again. You know, it's quite, you know, it's quite funny because it tends to kind of break the tension of, you know, any fears and anxiety might have.
Okay, lovely, thank you. And another question from Stephanie. What were the food intolerances, symptom-wise, like, and how did they clear up? How quickly did they clear up?
How quickly did they clear up? So the food intolerances, so it was general stomach illnesses. So I guess you would call it IBS symptoms or those kinds of things. Um, I I remember what, because this is quite a few years ago now, so it's probably 4 or 5 years ago. Um, what would happen, and again, the susceptibility thing, keeps coming up for me. So maybe I had some issues, and then I'd think, oh, I've had some issues here. I better stop eating that. And then I'd think, oh, well, hang on a second. So I've stopped eating that, but that also has this ingredient in. So maybe that will be a problem. And it did become a problem. So all of this kind of, thing just built and built and built. So it was kind of, more IBS kind of symptoms, sort of bloating and those kinds of things. It completely cleared up over, it took about a month, but I think it's when I originally started to, experience some of the grief from my mum dying. That came out still more later. But I think at that point I did start to at least experience some of the emotions that I'd been avoiding.
Great, thank you. And Julia has said that she will keep listening. So
Great. I'm really pleased to hear it.
at the risk of getting spots or something.
Well, the great thing, once you've kind of been through this process, a number of times, is that you start to recognize a symptom turns up, that's fine, your symptoms turned up, and rather than moving straight to a symptoms turned up anxiety, you move to a symptoms turned up, what am I not feeling, and then the anxiety just isn't there around the symptom, because it'll go again. You will recover from it when you start to deal with this stuff over here rather than looking at the symptom. I really don't focus too much on my symptoms 99% of the time these days. If something happens, which is very irregular these days, to be honest, if something happens, I don't go straight into this fear-based response. I go through my rational thought process of, this has turned up, what's happened over the last few days, or is about to happen, or is happening right now, and what can I therefore connect it to? My thought process is avoids the health anxiety side of things, the stress that you get naturally of something turning up that you don't really want in your life, but it's, eventually you just move to this other position of, it's okay, it's fine, it will recede again as soon as I start to deal with things.
And I think the other thing is that with this is actually looking at your life. And I know we did this, looking at our lives, excuse me, emotionally, physically, mentally, spiritually, and looking at how we can nurture each of those areas and bring things into our lives that nurture that, even to the extent of beginning to look at how you live your life and, work and your own time. And I know you've done that and really begun to look at your life and how can you make it one that you really want to live.
Yeah. Well, I've been a big holidayer, and what was really interesting actually was I caught myself, and this is what this work tends to do to you. I caught myself one day at work thinking, oh, I'm going to go and research some holidays. And I recognized at that time, this was a couple of years ago, that the reason I was researching holidays is because I was stressed and I wanted to get away from the feeling of being stressed. Now, the funny thing is I could have gone and bought that holiday and the stress that I was experiencing that day would already have gone. So the holiday, much as it would have been really nice, wasn't the thing that I really needed in that moment. What I needed was to be dealing with the stress that was happening. So yeah, it does start to make quite a big difference. And certainly there's, I see, these memes obviously on Facebook and things that everyone else does. And one of my friends, sent me one saying, design a life that you don't need a holiday from. And I had a little bit of a chuckle given that I'd connected those two things previously.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, thank you, Phil. So Dan says, was there anything different you did to deal with the acne, or was it the same process as with the book?
It was the same process. It's not, I think, there's not many people I've come across in the TMS world that have actually done the whole skin process thing, although there is a skin PDF out there, and basically it's the TMS process. It's no different. It's yeah, the process, I was going through experiencing, stress in my life, and I wasn't dealing with, the emotions. And once I was dealing with the emotions and also the health anxiety, the journeys that I was, the imagined journey that I was, creating for myself in the future of, you know, other people, from doing internet research, other people's journeys, and thinking, oh, I could be there in 5 years' time, calming all of that down, and also dealing with the emotions that had caused it in the first place, meant that, that it just resolved. So the
When I'm
process was no
working
different.
with people,
Sorry, what was that?
when I'm working with people, whatever
Mm.
symptoms they have, we don't talk about the symptoms much.
No.
After the assessment, it's getting an understanding of it, and yet just dipping in each time. But actually, this whole process is actually looking at your life, your personality, your behaviours, and really the symptoms are a byproduct, as we know, and it's
They
about dealing
are.
with the emotions.
And they are, and they can be they can be or seem very random as well. Things can turn. I had, in my worst days, I had all sorts of things turning up based on internet research that I'd been doing. And literally the next day, suddenly this symptom would occur that,
Yeah.
I had my friend who I mentioned who actually introduced me to SIRPA. I'd ring him and I'd say, this thing's just turned up, and he'd say, concentrate, rationalize.
Yeah.
You know that you didn't have this yesterday. It just turned up because you were doing the research.
Mm.
Yeah, it's very, very easy, I think, when you're a little bit health anxiety-ish to keep going down that path.
And I reckon I've had symptoms from virtually every system in my body,
Yeah.
over the years, and I've treated them all exactly the same.
Yeah, and same
It's
for me
just
as well.
another signal up what we're not dealing with.
Yeah.
Okay, moving forward, Lorraine says, where did you start with the journaling? Did you go really far back or concentrate on your life at the time?
Um, I think what you possibly mean with that is, did I have a look at my past, significantly? And I did. I think, it's great to look at your past and obviously, release emotions that you may have from, situations in your past that maybe you've been holding on to. But I also think, at some point, it's good to just start looking forward and saying, well, today, what do I want today to look like? What do I want tomorrow to look like? How can I help my life move in that direction? I think, one thing I see probably from the Facebook group is that a lot of people just keep going round and round and round and round and round the same
Yeah.
things, going, well, what am I not feeling? What have I not uncovered from, my past? And they're literally thinking back to, tiny incidents also almost, and thinking, well, that must have something to do with it. But it's not like that. What's happening for me now? What's happening for me today? How did that react? Get triggered? How does that relate to my past? Maybe releasing some of those things is great, but what's happening to me right now? What's happening to me in the next few days, months, years? Am I concerned about my welfare? Am I concerned about my pension? Am I concerned about this, that, and the other? Where do I think my life is going? Am I happy? Am I constantly fearful or stressed, about things that may be coming down the line? Those are probably the things that I really focus on these days. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about the past anymore.
Absolutely anymore. So, as you said, you addressed it. So any significant issues, and I remember you saying, dealt about anything from the past that was a significant issue, you journaled about at that time. But you do see people who know they need to dig around, and I have people who come to me saying, yeah, I've spent months and months journaling to try and find that one thing that must be there that's sort of unresolved, and often it isn't. And it often is because of their personality, their beliefs, their behaviours. Obviously, we are who we are because of our experiences in life.
We are.
But everything, if we're being triggered now, if we have a button pressing moment now, it's triggering things from the past. So it can really help to journal about big issues from the past, exploring our relationship with our parents, our relationship, our, anything that happened sort of in school years or whatever, anything significant that's happened, yeah, absolutely, it's about addressing that. But then it's like those neural pathways that of our behaviours, our beliefs, if there's something that triggers us in something that we see or feel or hear, it can trigger old pathways. And that's why they say if we're prejudiced, if we're judging other people by how they look, for example, it's our issues that we need to deal with because we're reacting to that.
It is.
It's about, if we explore what's happening now, it brings up things from the past. And an example of that for me was at the end of the first week of lockdown. I was sitting at my computer at about 4 o'clock on a Friday, and I just suddenly felt really low in mood, just really, and I just had no clue what had actually triggered this. I just felt tired, and I felt really low, very sad. And so what I did was I decided to be kind to myself and finish work early, and I journaled, and I offloaded how I felt. Now, I didn't know what the trigger was, why I felt how I felt, but I knew how I felt, so I acknowledged how I felt, acknowledged, expressed it onto paper. I then sat up straight. I put my shoulders back and I smiled, and I thought, okay, what do I feel grateful for? And I started writing down things I felt grateful for. And what can I do now to improve my mood? Because I still couldn't delve deep and acknowledge. No insights at that point came about what was the trigger. And so, but obviously it was all lockdown, and I was also well aware that my husband's in agriculture. He's not had much time off over lockdown, so I knew I was heading into a weekend of being on my own as well. Okay, so I had the week on my own and just seeing him in the evening, and then I had these at the weekend. I knew I was going to be on my own again. And so there was an online choir. I joined the online choir. I then went and played my keyboard for an hour, and I hadn't played it for about a year for various reasons. And by the end of that, I felt fine. Back to normal. I carried on with what I was doing, and I went upstairs. And in that moment, going upstairs, I suddenly had an insight, and just the words boarding school popped into my mind. It was just a complete aha moment. Oh, that makes sense. This feeling of being unable to escape, of feeling lonely, of not being able to see my family, was exactly how I felt at boarding school. So even though I journaled about boarding school, those neural pathways related to that are still there. And because I was in a similar situation with the same feelings, it triggered a bigger response than it might have for somebody else, because actually it was bringing up past issues, similar feelings from the past. So, and the reason I say that is because I didn't know what had caused it. I only found out the trigger afterwards, but I had already worked through it. But so often things are triggering us now, and they trigger old neural pathways, and it can be a thought, it can be a feeling, something we see, something we hear. And that's why people who go round and round and round journaling the same things over and over are actually keeping themselves in that cycle. And it's more important to actually get to the point of rationalising it, looking at what can I learn from this, how can I move forward, what will make things easier moving forward. And then you're also retraining yourself from just thinking about the negative, especially with health anxiety, to actually, okay, this is what I'm concerned about, this, and feel it, and then focus more on the rationalising it.
Yeah, the rationalizing, I think, is really, really important, actually, end of kind of journaling sessions. I talked a lot about, my journaling, and actually the technique that really helped me, which I know I probably mentioned to you, is I think therapists call like a two-chair technique. You would probably say unwritten letter, but I would do things in quite...
Two-chair, or even three-chair sometimes.
Yes, exactly. So I would do journaling sessions. Obviously, I was taking both positions, me and the other person, and I would say how I felt, and then they'd reply, and I'd say how I felt, and they'd reply, and it just goes kind of backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards, and that really helped me to discover how I felt. And I surprised myself sometimes about how I actually felt about certain situations, and they seemed quite deeply buried. They weren't things that I was particularly consciously aware of. I remember one particular session, I think I did 15 pages of this. backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. And I think in the middle, I ended up switching to another person. And then that person sort of said back to me, I don't think this has anything to do with me. This was all coming from me. And I went back to the original person. And it's just a technique for helping to expose how you feel, to help to understand, or expose the emotions that maybe you've been holding on to.
Yeah, absolutely.
That
And
was
so
great.
we would call that dialoguing. So if generating dialogue between two people.
Yeah.
The chair technique can be used with chairs, and this is what I
Yes.
encourage people, for example, of RSI, or aren't able to journal for whatever reason. That can be helpful to actually have two chairs and to sit in one chair as you, and then when you've had your say, you sit in the other chair and you respond as the other person. And sometimes I might stand in front of the chair, and I've done this in the past where somebody I was really angry with, and found their face, their picture on. I found a picture online, put it on the chair, and then I told him what for.
Yeah.
And I just really let loose. But then what was good was that I then sat in that chair, and then I began to think of it from his point of view and his experiences, etc.
Yeah.
And I was able to really be able to just sort of settle down and actually accept that, what from his position, why he would have been reacted angrily or whatever. But you can have a third person, three chairs, where you're the moderator, and you can then sit in the moderator's chair, and then you can actually respond. So that can be very helpful as well. Okay, so let's move on. Thank you for that, Phil. So Stephanie said, did you find that the symptoms correlated with the problem? And I think that, thinking back, because we've been talking a while, you did say at one point the spot popped up in a similar situation as well, didn't you?
Yeah. So I don't think it's always the case, but a lot of TMS symptoms do start with an actual physical injury, as in something that happens. And for people that have had it for years and years and years, they may not even remember that was where it started. The spot, I had the thought process, and the spot literally appeared on that eyelid there. So in that case, yes. Typically for me, but I don't know whether it is for everyone, but typically for me, it was when I would focus on something, attach some kind of negative focus to it. So, oh, I wonder if X, Y, Z will happen, was my, the biggest difficulty for me. And then that thing would typically happen. So yeah, but I don't think it's, and I think you would know better than I do, but I don't think it's always the case that that's the case.
Well, again, it's interesting when you talk about, situations, emotions, because, many people listening to this, you've probably heard of Louise Hay, and she used to talk about specific symptoms related to certain emotions, and there's no evidence base for it at all. I came across that about 20 years ago, and with interest, but no evidence base, but still personally I was interested. And I've had about half a dozen books about that since then. The one that I do use actually is a metaphysical anatomy book. It is like a big textbook, not inexpensive, but it is interesting. And when there are clients who are interested, then sometimes I will, look and see what the underlying emotional cause of that particular symptom is. And I have to say, there's usually something in there that helps create trigger an insight for people.
Yeah.
But there is a bit of evidence base for the metaphysical approach, but there's not a huge amount, so I wouldn't go out publicly talking about this. But actually, if you're interested, it's worth, I would say, why not have a look? But it's not necessary. You can still work on this yourselves anyway. Okay, so so Flick says, which Facebook TMS group are you active in that's really valuable? And it's I always forget, do they call it the tension myoneural syndrome one or the tension myositis?
I can have a look. If that's...
So we can probably find a link actually.
Yeah, if you search for, it's tension myositis syndrome, it's called. It's that one. There's nearly 3,000 people in it.
Yeah, it's a good one. I think that's it.
It is.
It's that one. And yeah, worth going in. But again, not living in it. You know,
No,
we
I would
have
agree with that.
groups like that where there are people that are constantly in there, and this is about learning to live your life and move on. But if there's something to look at and ask about, fine.
Yeah, it is, and maybe someone there, can give you a little bit of confidence that, the specific symptoms being heard about, or,
Absolutely.
those kinds of things. I think I agree with you though, that it's very sad when you see people just coming back and back and back. And I always recommend at that point that, people go and see a TMS therapist, because it's clear that they're not managing to uncover the things for them which are problematic in their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. Lovely, thank you. So Daniel says, great, thanks for the great response. I had bad acne as a kid and have started to believe that was also TMS. Guess what started to show up? Back to the process for me.
Yeah, yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I wondered the same. I mean, children do have acne, and it's obviously talked about as being, hormone based and things. I'm not a doctor. I don't know the physical side of that, but that I don't know. I just always feel like maybe certainly bad chronic acne, there may be, even in teenagers, might be related to emotions, because from again what I understand, TMS stuff can start to appear, relatively early in life.
Very, very.
It can happen in children. So yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if that was the case, although I don't think I've really done any research because I don't want to do that anymore.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, we know that the hypothalamus is the conductor of the orchestra. In other words, it regulates everything in the body, including the hormones. And we know that stress affects the hypothalamus. So I absolutely, if there's a teenager struggling with chronic acne, then I would definitely be, concerned and thinking, okay, what is going on there? So
Yeah.
definitely. Okay, so Zoe has shared the link to the TMS group.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So Zoe's in the background there, passing everything on to us. So thank you very much. So, yeah, Lorraine says, thank you, it's helpful. Makes a lot of sense to her now. Thank you so much. And that's good timing because we're actually just coming up to the end and we've come to
We
the
are.
questions. So thank you very much, everybody, first of all, for sending in your questions, because it would be a bit boring if we just sat here.
It would.
It wouldn't be boring because you're
Nice
not.
to have stuff to talk about.
We still got lots to talk about, but it's actually good because it means that we're responding to specific queries that people have, which is always nice. So is there any final thing you'd like to say, Phil, maybe about something that you feel is the most important insight you gained, or the thing you'd most like to share with others?
So it probably is that, I understand, when you're going through this, it's not nice, it's not enjoyable. But there will come a time when you will look back on this and think, this is the best thing that could have happened to me. It's the best thing that could have happened to me. And there's so many, looking back, there's so many things in my life now which I owe to the journey, which frankly wouldn't have happened unless I was sort of pushed this way, by having chronic pain. I just would have ignored it, and I would have had a life which was less than I could have had.
Yeah, absolutely, that's great. I always love it when people say that, because I think that myself personally as well. It's completely changed the way I live my life. So just finally, Stephanie says that was fantastic, thank you. Julia says it's great to get some ideas about different ways to journal. I'm hugely resistant and recently realised part of this is criticism I got over the years for ugly but readable handwriting. So yeah, good point there, Julia. So express that. If that's part for you, then you can use some journaling to actually explore that. Or you can just talk into the phone, and pretend you're talking to an old teacher, for example. Or you could do the chair technique, or you could just scroll. When I journal, you can't read my writing.
No, actually, same for me.
Scroll it and then rip it away.
So I type a lot of mine out of interest, but when I do write, you can't read it. I don't need to go back on it. That's not the point. Some people do occasionally ask, do I need to keep these journals and things? And that's not the point. The point is uncovering the emotions and expressing them.
And also to be uncensored, completely
Completely.
Because you know what, if I had a fear that somebody might read my journaling at some point, I wouldn't be as uncensored. And
No,
so this is about really being able to, be like a 3 or 4 year old. How would they react? And they said, "I hate you. I wish you weren't my dad. Wish you were dead." If then that's how we should be offloading and really acknowledging the thoughts that we have and the
it
feelings.
is, and that's extremely important. In the early days, certainly, my journaling was quite censored. It was almost more like a dear diary. Dear diary, today
Yes,
something good happened and things were great. This is very, very early days, and then 2 or 3 months in, I'm like, I hate everyone, and this is terrible, and it's almost that temper tantrum that you don't allow yourself to have,
absolutely.
and that you do need to allow yourself to have.
Good, kind, nice people.
Yes, exactly.
So just to finish on then, Caroline says she's an osteopath, and she says, "Thank you, Phil and Georgie. As a newbie to this, it's fascinating. Your clarity of thought and frankness is lovely to see." So that's
Oh,
really,
well.
and I'm really enjoying these. I love getting back to chat to people like you, Phil, to meet new people like Dan, whom I hadn't really talked to properly before. Um, and we will be doing some more. Just need to get in contact with some people, but the aim is to continue with these because I do feel that they're valuable. So thank you everybody for listening, and thank you so much, Phil, for joining us and for
No
sharing.
problem at
Please go
all.
open and frank, because I think that's what people are saying, is that it's so lovely to hear people being very open about this and sharing their stories.
Well,
So
I'm very glad.
good. Thank you very much. Goodbye, everybody. Bye.
Bye.